on one part, from Cornell, hopefully, from Louvain in Belgium, and from HEC-Montréal. So each presenter will have 13 minutes to deliver his or her material. And we will have just one question and answer period at the end of the presentation. So let's just start with Dr. Min Li from South China University of Technology. She will talk to us from Guangzhou, China. And she is accompanied by her doctoral student, Xiaoli Hu. So, Dr. Min?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, yeah, let's share my, transfer my, good morning, Roger. Gregor, everyone, it's nice to meet you. Today, my presentation is about internationalization of Cambodia, government, factories, industrial relations, governance. So my colleague, co-author is my PhD student, Xiaoli. Okay. First of all, I want to introduce my research context. You know, everyone noticed China conducted One Belt and Road initiative. So we transfer our research interest to the aligned countries, including Cambodia. That's one reason. The other reason is that the garment industry, whether it is Western developed countries or developing countries like China, during the industrialization period, garment textile industry was the first industry to become developed. So with growing labor costs and advance of the technology and transportation, the motivation and the mobility, profit-driven capture have shifted the garment manufacture from developed countries to the developing countries. So, so we notice the formation of global garment industry chain closely connected with the whole global network. We could find geographical disparate companies specializing in garment design, manufacture, and distribution, and local or foreign brands or retailers based in the developed countries, and manufacture sector based in developing countries. So this is the whole global garment chain. So we notice the garment factories in the center, the stakeholders around the factories, including the local government, host government, and lead firms, consumers, also including ILO, NGOs, and also union. Okay, and these factories accept orders and deliver their productions to the middle agents or lead firms, and lead firms or agents sell their products to the developed market, including the leader firms or retailers in importing nations. So Finger one shows the global garment industry and its stakeholders. And with this research context, we raise 3 questions focused on Cambodia. First question is with the formation of the global apparel industry chain, how does the industrial relation governance of Cambodian garment factories achieve internationalization? So this is typical case. Unlike China export and also consumer garment products, but Cambodia emphasized on the export. So the first question. The second question is the weapons. What weapons do various actors use to fight, negotiate, and cooperate within the industry chain network? The third question, have the rights and interests of workers during the global chain, especially in Cambodia garment factories, been protected or improved? So following the three questions, we use we set three series. The first is the industrial relation system theory. The second is the new theory, weaponized interdependence. The third is the third is stakeholder. Yeah, stakeholder series. So we found the tripartite system transfer to multiple industrial relation actors, including management, unions, government, and the governments also include local and the host government, international agents, NGOs. And based on the literature, we raised three kind of weapons or power. One is political authority, the other is economical leverage, and the third is public mobilization. And in detail, the weapons adapted by stakeholders in industrial relation governance, we explained what exactly means. The political authority refers to rational legal authority. It is an important source of power for government officials and politicians. It is directly authorized by constitutions and laws. The second is economical leverage. The lead firms dominated by driven global value chain. And third is public mobilization. It means worker unions, organization, or consumer movements. So this is three kind of weapons we found in literature. Okay, and we want to identify the three kind of weapons, how these three kind of weapons influence the manufacture factories and how to influence the results of the workers' interests and the work rights. So we used a case study and choose Cambodia. The first reason to choose Cambodia is that Cambodia to match match our research questions, and also case study is good methodology to answer why and how research questions. The third reason is to compare and modify existing theories. So, and we went to Cambodia last August to do field work, and we interview multiple actors, and we found literature, documents, and archive data. So this is our interviews, including the workers, business owners, and brand representatives, and CLC. CLC means Cambodia Labor Confederation, and also including the Ministry of Labor and the Vocational Training, Garment Manufacturers in Cambodia. You know, we have a good relationship with, China has good relationship with Cambodia, so it's possible for us to contact these government officials, and local government officials help us to contact with the business owner and workers. So this is a research methodology. And based on the interview data, we use the coding, the typical coding way, including the open coding and actual coding. So it is simple. Okay. Finally, I want to introduce in detail about our research findings. We found 3 kind of weapons actually influence the employers' attitudes and behavior. And also we found the 4th weapon, that means professional training. So including the professional training, totally 4 kind of weapon as independent variables influence the employers' attitudes, and also further influence the workers' rights, individual rights, and collective rights. So in detail, political authority means the local government, I mean Cambodia state, they could conduct their labor law to push the employer to change their attitude and behavior. And the US state in 1999, Tata Agreement required an improvement in labor standards in the Cambodia garment industry to exchange for export quotas to the US market. And also ILO and Better Factory Cambodia, this is program, supervised labor standards in the Cambodia garment industry. And ILO is quite formal. If a factory applies for an import and export license, the ILO will check the factory, and the factory must meet their requirement. So this kind of political authority actually influence the Cambodia manufacturer owner behavior and attitudes. The second is academic leverage, including some lead firms send representatives to Cambodia to deal with the labor standards. And however, some buyers pay less attention to labor conditions. In a surprise, during the interview, we found without bribing inspectors that are sent by buyers, manufacturers would not pass inspections. So this is a real world. Okay, the third is public mobilization. Trade unions and customer, they also influence the manufacturer owners. The last one, we found ILO and also Better Factory Cambodia. This program actually affect or influence the manufacturers owners, such as training. They supply training through CTI, Center of Training Institutions, and implant training. Okay, so actually the dependent variable or the final results we found achievements. For example, the salary, the previous 2000 $40 per month, but last year 182 per month. The second is their right of association. Previous 2000 limited right to freedom of association, but now the workers are free to join and exit trade union. Okay, the 70% Better Factory Cambodia factories and more than 1 trade unions. And last one is their collective bargaining. Before 2000, no collective bargaining. Strikes were common, but right now, industry level and workplace level, collective bargaining and strikes are rare. Right now, we have finished the field work in Myanmar. Myanmar strikes are very, very common. And last is our conclusion. The globalization of industrial chain can affect the sovereign nations' monopoly on the industrial relation governance in industry chain upstream factories. The influence existed by stakeholders. We call these weapons, okay? And the last is that the rights and interests of workers in the garment factories in Cambodia continue to improve during internationalization. So that's my presentation. Thank you. Okay. 13 minutes.
You were really right on time. Even 20 seconds less than what you plan. So
thank you, thank you.
You're perfect.
Thank you, thank you. Okay.
So I think that our second speaker, Christopher Raymond, is now with us. Is it the case, Evelyn?
Yes, he effectively connected.
Sorry.
Okay, so Christopher, the floor is yours for 13 minutes.
If you have any technical issues, do you have a PowerPoint? Just want to make sure.
Okay.
Perfect.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christopher Raymond. I'm a third-year PhD student at Cornell ILR School, and I'll be presenting today on labor transnationalism and horizontal solidarities in the Bangladeshi garment industry. This is some research as part of my master's thesis. So what we have here is the 2019 ITUC Global Rights Index. As we can see, respect for labor rights is varied across geographic region. And this project was inspired by the lack of progress in Bangladesh in particular. Bangladesh has consistently been one of the top 10 ITUC's top 10 worst countries for violence against trade unionists, lack of freedom of association, and the mass dismissal of workers following attempts to organize or mobilize in any significant way. And this has been the case despite the intervention of major global union federations, including Industrial and Uni Global Union, most notably in the Accord, which was implemented following the Rana Plaza collapse in 2013. So just to briefly speak on labor transnationalism, it's generally broadly defined as any sort of collaboration or active solidarity between unions or workers in multiple countries. And it's based on the idea that unions and workers are able to leverage structural, associational, and coalitional power, particularly in contexts where local unions or workers have little power themselves. However, there's a significant balance of power within the labor movement itself, particularly focusing on the imbalance of power between global North Union federations, which many of the global union federations themselves are based in Europe or North America, or at least their most prominent members are from the global North, whereas global South unions tend to be weaker. And this introduces what Mark Anner has called the paradox of labor transnationalism, where the campaigns for transnational solidarity, it has this tension between the interests of workers and unions in the global South is tempered by their dependence on the global North unions for support. And historically, labor transnationalism has fallen into two major categories. One is transnational activist campaigns. These tend to be short-lived, focused on a particular brand or retailer or supplier factory, particularly in the garment industry, and was particularly common. And there's a significant literature on various campaigns in the 1990s and early 2000s. And for a while, this strategy has continued within the garment industry specifically. However, Mark Anner and Marissa Brooks, along with other scholars, have shifted attention towards transnational labor alliances or networks, which are more formal and long-lasting chains of labor transnationalism. In particular, transnational activist campaigns, which focus primarily on the name and shame mechanism, would see initial success, but it proved difficult to sustain success over the long term. Often you would see, after the conclusion of a successful campaign, the factory would shut down, the union, which was able to receive recognition, was undercut a few years later. So there's been an increased interest in the formation of transnational labor alliances, which have historically been focused primarily within the automobile and maritime and shipping industry, not so much in the garment industry. And another particular issue for the Bangladesh case is labor movement fragmentation. There's not much existing scholarship on the effects of labor movement fragmentation, but there's a general assumption that fragmentation weakens the labor movement. And it's a prominent issue or feature of many global South labor movements, including India, Cambodia, and Bangladesh. There are multiple sources for this. Some of it is genuine political or ideological differences. And some of this is employer-induced through the formation of yellow unions. And in many post-colonial or post-dictatorship or post-authoritarian states, you also have to deal with the issue of corporatist legacies. However, research on Indonesia from Terry Carraway and Michelle Ford has found that institutions can facilitate collaboration and coordination between unions. So my broad research questions for this project are: how do global union federations attempt to build solidaristic transnational labor alliances in the apparel industry? And how do global union federations build solidarity in fragmented union movements? And perhaps a even broader overarching question is, why has labor transnationalism failed to improve labor rights in Bangladesh? So this research for this project was conducted over 3 field visits in Bangladesh in 2019 and 2020. I conducted 34 semi-structured interviews in English and Bangla. These lasted approximately 45 minutes to 2 hours, and I used purposive and snowball sampling to obtain responses. So just a little background on Bangladesh. It's the 2nd largest garment exporter in the world, behind China, and apparel exports account for approximately 80% of the country's exports earnings, making it one of the largest and most important industries within the country. And this has significant political and economic consequences, particularly as the sector has strong employers associations with both the garment manufacturers and knitwear manufacturers having separate employers associations. Bangladesh also has a fragmented labor movement with a number of politically affiliated labor federations, many of which came out of earlier periods of military rule. And overall, there's weak enforcement of labor rights by the state. Within the garment sector, however, the history of the garment sector's labor movement is different than that of the multi-sectoral labor federations, many of which are concentrated in formerly or currently state-owned enterprises. And independent garment unions first started appearing in the 1990s. However, since then, there's been some subsequent proliferation, and there are approximately 80 current federations. However, a significant number of these are what one of my interviewees termed laptop federations. Although it's difficult to form a factory level union in Bangladesh, the legislation for forming federations, which is simply 2 or more factory level unions is relatively easy. So employers will often hire someone to act to fill out the federation paperwork in order to prevent legitimate unionization. And approximately 50% of the current federations can be categorized as either laptop federations or simply yellow unions. And within Bangladesh, there are a few collective agreements, and there's a general lack of recognition by the state and employers of workers and unions as legitimate partners. So, although the Accord has gotten most of the attention in Bangladesh, there's also a number of other instances of labor transnationalism in Bangladesh, which differs from many other government-producing countries. The Solidarity Center has been active in Bangladesh for a while. Previous iterations were involved in going back even during the Pakistani colonial rule. And Industrial, in addition to the Accord, has a number of initiatives, one of which being the Industrial Bangladesh Council, which is a conglomeration of its affiliated unions in both the government sector as well as textiles and chemicals. And I'll speak a little more to that. And lastly, the Industrial has floated action, collaboration, and transformation as a way to achieve living wages through collective bargaining in Bangladesh and other countries. I believe Cambodia was set as the first pilot, and as far as I understand, the implementation process has been stalled. So during my interviews, it came up that a few unions were aware of ACT's or ACT's existence, but it had not manifested itself in Bangladesh yet. So while labor transnationalism has had little effects on the conditions of the Bangladesh garment industry, what we see is that labor protests and mobilization has had a significant effect, particularly on minimum wages. Legally, sectoral tripartite minimum wage bargaining is scheduled every 3 to 5 years. However, particularly in recent history, each minimum wage increase has only been preceded by worker unrest, including in 2006, 2013, and 2018. And a particular issue that interviewees pointed to was the lack of fair representation on the tripartite minimum wage boards. The state has exerted a significant influence in determining wages, often setting unilaterally when employers and unions or the union representative aren't able to reach any sort of compromise. However, there are few gains outside of minimum wages, although indicating that there's a disconnect between unions and mobilizing workers. However, unions have tried, particularly in the most recent protests, to back workers more fully. So just to wrap up, what we see here is limited influence by global union federations and local solidarities. Formal structures like the Industrial Bangladesh Council are insufficient in promoting solidarities wholeheartedly. However, and significantly, the Accord and other initiatives thus far haven't failed to improve social dialogue. The Accord is limited in scope, only dealing with issues of building and fire health and safety. And we see significant employer resistance to efforts to improve social dialogue in the sector. Unlike Cambodia, participation in the Better Works program isn't tied to export status, so it's seen little adoption in Bangladesh. But despite the ineffectiveness of international efforts, worker mobilization has facilitated union collaboration, but gains have been minimal. And in particular, the inability to independently select labor representatives on minimum wage boards suggests that the lack of fair institutions undermines what positive effects they might have for union collaboration. And a final question I had was, do apparel sector transnational labor alliances inherently differ than those in other industries, or are differences explained by strategy? So thinking about the nature of transnational alliances in other sectors, this is primarily driven by peer-to-peer unions or workers, whereas industrial perception within the Bangladesh industry, garment industry by other unionists is more professional unionists rather than workers themselves. So that's all I have, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Christopher, for your presentation. We'll now turn to Kai-Hsin Huang for his presentation, which will focus on data protection and data workers in India.
Kai, we cannot hear what you're saying. You're gonna have to call us like you did previously if you want us to hear you, because we can see your share screen, but we cannot hear you. Okay, we're gonna go to the next speaker.
Yeah, we'll go to Kamila.
Yes.
Is Kamila there?
Yeah, she's there.
Okay.
I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So hi everyone, I'm delighted to share with you this, this presentation today. It is actually a contribution that was written during my research stay at the CRIMT Research Center, where I had the pleasure to be invited by Professor Gregor Murray. So thank you again for having me there. So yeah, this presentation is about self-initiated expatriation, and more specifically, the experiential journey of expatriates when they are abroad. So you might be familiar with the concept of expatriate failure. So most of the time, when we talk about the expatriation of highly qualified mobile workers, we tend to analyze their experiences based on their potential success or perhaps the failure of the experience in itself. So the very discussion about the outcomes of an expatriation in general remains vigorous, and especially when we want to understand what is, what this experience can bring to companies most of the time. So the idea behind the expatriation, the expatriate failure was actually defined as a kind of premature return to the home country. So most of the time we will tend to associate the fact that some workers decide to go back to their home country to the fact that there is some kind of failure in their experience abroad. And this very uniparametric theorization has been pointed as very controversial and by many authors, obviously. And the main issue was that it was positioned as a very dichotomic perspective that was imposed upon the experience of those workers. So qualitative studies have traditionally focused on analyzing the organization's views, which seem to be very obvious because we really focused on the experience of those workers when they are employed abroad. However, some authors have recently invited researchers to also pay attention to the experience of expatriates themselves, and not only to the perspective of organizations. Because most of the time, if we can define this premature return as sufficient enough to say that the worker did not make it abroad, there are also other parameters that are part of the equation for those mobile workers that may lead them to define their experience abroad as being a success, and so even if they went back to the home country earlier. So this is why most of the time this dichotomic theorization, where success tend to be opposed to failure, was challenged. Specifically, investigate more traditional forms of expatriation. So in the case of company-backed workers, so traditional assigned expatriates, we really raised some questions about this very theorization. And so in order to better understand the reality of those workers, we decided in this study to focus on another category of mobile workers. So instead of focusing on assigned expatriates or traditional expatriates, we wanted to investigate the experiential journeys of self-initiated expatriates. So self-initiated expatriates are workers who decide for themselves without any support from the part of the organization to move abroad, so to leave their home employer and then to move abroad in order to live a new experience. So in the case of these workers, it was very beneficial to question the acceptation of the word failure, and more specifically, how they conceive their expatriation. Is it some kind of fixed experience, or is it more some kind of process in which they evolve and in which they grow? So this was actually the question we wanted to ask. So what is really interesting about self-initiated expatriates is that those workers will initiate, as I said, their own expatriation without any support, which means that they will decide for themselves whether and when they will actually return to the home country. Most of the time, from a more managerial perspective, it is highly challenging for organizations to retain those kind of workers, and not only to hire them, because they appear as being some boundaryless careerists, which is not really appealing to organizations willing to recruit some loyal and reliable workforce. So here it was interesting to question how those mobile workers in a very specific context, one of the globalized context, a globalized working environment, how do they live their experience abroad? And even if they decide to go back to the home country, what did they get from that experience? So why did you want to focus on self-initiated expatriates? So some authors have recently suggested that it was crucial to start investigating some specific expatriate groups who have actually the same profile. So here we focused on engineers. Yeah, so this was the main sample was composed of engineers, and we wanted to give them to give those people a voice to express their own expatriate failure reality. And when I say expatriate failure, it does not mean that we question them about the failures they encountered, but we decided to use this as a kind of window that we wanted to open to have access to their experience, to the way they conceive things in a very dynamic way. So we use obviously a qualitative approach, because here it was the most important thing for us was to have access to people's social construction. So to do so, we engaged in an inductive qualitative study where we investigated the very definition of what constitutes a failure for those workers, and yeah, in order to have access to their main experience. So we interviewed 20 self-initiated expatriates who are actually STEM workers, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics workers, experts. And those people relocated to the US or to Canada from Europe. So the approach was highly inspired by Suter and colleagues' work. And those authors engaged in qualitative study in order to move away from logical influence groups like expatriates about experiences that are lived within the organization, but which actually tend to escape this organizational boundary that tend to be perceived.
Okay, it seems we have lost Kamila. Okay, so we have completely lost Kamila. She's probably reconnecting. I know Kai is now ready, depending on when you want to do, Roger.
Well, let's wait a minute or two if Kamila just not to interrupt her presentation. Let's see. Otherwise, we'll shift to Kai.
Can hear me? There was an interruption.
Yes, we can hear you, but your screen seems to be a bit frozen right now. I cannot reach her with the chat.
Maybe we should go over to Kai's presentation, Roger, and then see if Kamila can work through the issue.
Yeah. Oh, I think she's back.
Me? Sorry, the Wi-Fi is not working that well. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but your screen is frozen.
Maybe she should turn off the video.
Yeah. Are you able to turn off your video, Kamila? I cannot even do it for her. Normally I would be able to, but I'm not able to, so.
Okay, so maybe Evelyn, let's try with Kai, and we can hopefully reconnect with Kamila later on.
Okay, perfect. Kai, I see you're connected. I will activate your sound. Can you talk?
Oh, great. Hi, everyone. So I'm connecting with my phone, and then I'll be presenting from my computer because there's mic issues earlier. So bear with me, and yeah, let's get this going. Let me just share my screen. Everyone can see, correct? Yes? Okay. So yeah, I'm Kai, and greetings from Montreal, and thank you to the organizer and also to CRIMT. So I mentioned that my title of my research is going to be changing a bit, but I think it nicely aligns with two of our previous presenters as well. And so the research is on data workers in India and the global data value chains supporting AI systems. And this research was done in conjunction with a Bangalore-based NGO called IT for Change with support from the International Development Research Center in Ottawa. So I thought this quote that I found in the Metro in Bangalore is quite helpful. And it reads, data runs the world, but what fuels it? And this is particularly helpful in our exploration into the working and living conditions of data workers. So the question that I want to answer is, what are the working and living conditions of data workers who are also sometimes called micro workers, who are doing the data processing tasks needed to build the data sets within the context of training AI systems? And to answer this question, we received 94 survey responses in a workplace out of a total of 220 workers. We received 14 interviews in 4 languages with management and workers, and with an equal number of males and female participants. And to ground this research, we also conducted co-learning workshops and also expert interview prior and also after the research. And to validate the finding, we also had mutual learning and listening sessions back in November of last year in Delhi and Bangalore with the firm, workers and researchers and the policy community there. So I would like to share with you a profile of who these data workers are and who we interviewed. So information about her and her name has been changed, and she has consented for us to use her photo for the purpose of this research. So her name is Genevieve. She's a data processing analyst. So she's going to be sharing with us a typical working day, and so that we can get a glimpse into what this world of work for these data workers look like. But before that, let's go into what the data value chain actually is. So large volume of data are generated and collected about us every day through our applications on our cell phones and also on any technology intermediated devices that we need to interact with. So this large volume of data that's needed need to be analyzed and processed so that new information and insights can be gathered in order for it to have value. And this is largely because data in itself is what's called an experience good, meaning that its value can only be realized after it's being used. So therefore, data needs to be analyzed and processed before it can be sold, before that it can actually have a monetary value. To make this more concrete, here's an illustration of what a data process and analysis might look like within this value chain. So here's an example of Amazon SageMaker Ground Truth platform, which is a platform designed to address one of the most fundamental bottlenecks of the broad deployment of AI systems, which is the need for large volume of high quality training data. So after data is generated and collected, a data worker needs to manually label and sort this. And afterwards, so this labeled data is fed back into a training model here in the middle here. And afterwards, easily recognizable data can be labeled automatically, which is the loop that's going up. And for ones that are more ambiguous, it will need to be sent back to a human data worker for further processing. And this process will repeat. And the end result of this is that the data that's being processed can create an accurate training data set to help AI systems to detect meaningful patterns in future data that it receives. And for this research, we're going to be focusing on the humans that are embedded in this process. So where does these data workers or micro workers come from? According to Amazon's internal reports, human data workers are sourced in 3 ways. First, through the Amazon Mechanical Turks platform, which is a crowdwork platform with 500,000 gig workers. Second, through a private labeling workforce. And lastly, through a third-party vendor model where contracting and subcontracting of data processing can take place across geographic dispersion. So for the case that I want to present, let's go back. Okay, we're going to look more in depth into a third-party vendor called Indie Village, located in rural India. So after 10 years in operation, Indie Village has over 200 employees and it has plans to rapidly expand. At full capacity, it has 1,700 hours of daily work, and of this, 70% or 1,200 hours of work is dedicated to data processing for building AI systems. Well, who are these data workers? So now let's return back to Genevieve, who is a data processing analyst at Indie Village. So based on the interviews and the survey averages, Genevieve is 22 years old. She has an undergraduate degree. And most likely, this position is her first transition into the world of work in rural India. And she has been, she's also not allowed to work overtime or night shifts, which are options this is largely because at home, she needs to look after one child and the parents of her husband while her husband works overseas in the Middle East. Now let's delve into more of her working day. So this morning, Genevieve's arrival at work was recorded with her biometric fingerprint and a photo of her face at the front door. She works from 9:30 to 6:30 with 1 hour for lunch and breaks, 6 days a week. And this morning, her arrival was late at 9:33. And because she was late by 3 minutes, her pay for that day was deducted by half. Her monthly pay is 9,300 rupees, or approximately 170 Canadian, or $7 a day, and which is close to the average of entry positions for her age group in India. However, we further inquire about this pay, and it was shared that this 9,300 rupees is inadequate to meet Genevieve's daily needs or the needs of her family. Next, so in the workplace, there are many eyes, like in the garment factories as well, usually of men, and of cameras everywhere surveilling Genevieve and her colleagues. Her arrival this morning, as mentioned, was recorded biometrically. At her computer, she needs to open Clockify, which is a work time tracking software where she must demonstrate that she's working for at least 8 hours a day. Her emails are read and filtered. The internet access and use is highly, highly restricted. And Genevieve is further monitored via her daily production targets, which I'll talk about in a bit. So these hyper-surveillance practices in workplaces are examples of digital terrorism, which uses data to control, exploit, and discipline the quantified worker. Now, how does Indie Village operate? So Genevieve production target for today is 2,300 points. So the points are awarded based on each accurate human judgment that should provide based on the object that she's processing. And there's 1 point per right judgment that she performs. There are approximately 5 to 50 judgments per task. And these tasks are rebundled up into processes, and then these processes are repackaged into larger projects. And these tasks can be in the form of sound files, images, graphics, objects, or text. And through this, we can begin to see how humans are kept in the loop in data processing and how the production is organized and reorganized, or fragmented and dematerialized and rematerialized. In the afternoon, Genevieve show us 3 examples of the type of data processing work she's performing. So first, the most common task at this site is the data annotation for computer vision, like box bounding, which is the usage of an image where data workers will need to identify accurately objects within this image, such as here. Next, one of the unexpected surprises that I learned was Genevieve knew quite a lot about the city of Ottawa, where I'm from. And this is largely because she's conducting sentiment analysis on the social media posts about the city, where she would need to filter the tweets referencing the city into positive, neutral, or negative sentiment and entering metadata about it. So we asked, what is the hardest task that you need to perform? And multiple workers said that it's quiz mode, which is used to maintain quality control and the accuracy of human judgment. This is how it tests whether or not your judgment is correct. So how it is done is an image like this on retinal thinning will be shared to 7 data workers, and then they will have to vote whether or not there are signs of retinal thinning or not. So the workers who voted with the majority, let's say 4 out of 7 would be awarded with points. So we can see that Genevieve is hyper-surveilled at work, while she also surveils us. And this is where Shoshana Zuboff and others are beginning to say it's a new form of surveillance capitalism, which uses our data by corporations and government can better predict, target, and control our behaviors and even thoughts. Now let's talk about the value chain itself. So with all this work, Genevieve largely remains in the dark about which client that she's working for, but she knows that she works on data related to California. Then she's largely unaware where the data she's processing is coming from, or where it might be going, and how it might be used afterwards. And I think this, these two quotes demonstrate how opaque this value chain actually is, and then potentially the need for greater transparency and accountability around the governance of these new value chains. And before I close, I would like to further problematize surveillance, data, and privacy. So it is almost 7 p.m. For her. And I think with more remote work options due to COVID-19, the issues of workplace surveillance, data of workers and privacy are becoming more and more visible and important. So first, the transparency paradox, which talks about has more data collected about us. It is supposed to give us more information and transparency. However, often there's very little that's actually known on how our data is being used or transformed by our employers, mediated by tech firms. Second, I think more investigation need to go into the potential trade-offs between data protection and privacy laws that are there to enhance protection for certain individuals, usually in the global north, and how that translates into new requirements that places more surveillance and worse working conditions for data workers in India and elsewhere. Third, there is a new form of refractive surveillance where the research by Levy and Barakas 2018 says, retailers are collecting data about consumers to facilitate a new form of managerial control over workers. And here we're seeing that through the control of workers in hyper-surveilled environments, it is also a refractive surveillance of these panoptic sort on us as individuals in society at large, by employers and for employers, has one example. And lastly, data, its extraction, use, transformation through the lens of surveillance and control. It's a new form of power, and that is greatly imbalanced. And I think these are questions that I want to further interrogate, and then also hopefully introduce the notion of data relations within industrial relations as well. And with that, I would like to close. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kai. Is Kamila back with us, Evelyn?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we see her, yeah.
Sorry for the interruption, sorry. So I'm gonna share my PowerPoint here, share my screen. Yeah, here it is. Can you see it?
Yes.
So I guess it's okay. So yes, so for the methods, we decided to interview respondents in their own native language in order to allow, in order to provide as much as possible their own interpretation and stay faithful to their own ways to express their own ideas when it comes to their own experiences of failure and successes. So we opted for sim-structured interviews because it was the most suitable technique to ensure this thematic coverage that we wanted to reach. And it also allowed, of course, to have some more flexible, some more open discussions where the respondent can always share things that do not seem really related to the question, but which of course stays very relevant when we want to capture their own perspective. So as the experience of failure is a very sensitive topic, we also integrated some questions related to non-successful experiences of SIE's colleagues. So not directly asking them about their experience of failure, but perhaps sometimes just questioning them about some colleagues if they are aware of some experiences that, according to them, were not did not happen as expected at the beginning. So the results offer us some very reflexive approaches about their personal perspectives, but also non-reflexive perspectives that, when connected, offer a very broad and very rich picture of what it is to be an expatriate and how they deal on an everyday basis with the circumstances, actions, and situations that are part of their experiences. So here are some, here are the results. So I selected some quotes in order to illustrate some of the main aspects that were captured during this study. So first, the concept of failure is nonsensical. So for the expatriates, most of the time, we see that the idea of this dichotomic success and failure conceptualization does not make sense. So this was one of the main very, how can I say that this was, we actually accepted this kind of result. But what is really interesting here, and can see this from a quote from a respondent who said that, but talk about failure when we are in a situation where we make the choice to leave, it's different. I will not talk about failure. I think that when we leave our country, we have time to make it, to find adjustments or the company that suits us best. So what is interesting here in this quote is the idea of time, being some kind of master of time. When they are master of time, they do not only master the experience in itself, but they can also adjust to the everyday situations that they live, and try to not only adjust, but also adapt the complete framing and mindset that they will indulge in. So expatriation is also perceived complex process. So it's not the story of an experience. It's not a kind of main story. This is more the elaboration that the worker makes based on different situations, different short stories. So here we have this respondent who says, in France, I had a blog that I contributed to with small articles every week, but since I arrived in Montreal, I'm not really very active anymore. Sometimes I miss it. I think it's one of the things I have not managed to integrate into my life. I know it's just a blog, but it was deeply embedded into my everyday life. Now it's like I'm missing something. So for the story, this respondent was highly satisfied with his professional experience, with their professional experience abroad. So technically and professionally, this might perfectly fit in this success that we defined at the beginning of this presentation. But then we can see that it is way more complex of experiencing everyday successes. Being in a kind of expatriation success is a complex process where the professional dimension, of course, needs to match the personal one, the private dimension. So this worker really expected to have the opportunity to evolve in a very dynamic, very challenging work environment. This is what they found in Montreal. But then from a more personal, private side, they did not have this time, the same time that they actually have when it comes to mastering this experience. So they are mastering time to a certain extent, but then they do not have this quality time that they would like to have in order to really enjoy this expatriation journey. So when we talk about this complex process, it's about the feeling of success. The feeling of success, which is here a core element in this study, is more complex than just a basic causal effect that we would find between the realization of a main objective, an expatriation objective, and then the sense of success that would logically result from this completion. So then you have the feelings that are related to a lack rather than the complete failure. And this point was very interesting because it allowed us to highlight to reveal some very important aspects here in the experience of expatriates, of self-initiated expatriates, and which is the fragments of failure. So fragments of failure is the expression we use to define some kind of flows in SI's experiences where they do not reach this kind of realization because there are some other things, other small flows that obscure the very sense of success that would have experienced. So technically, we identified the kind of triptych of immaterial attachment, which would lead to fragments of failure. So you have here a quote from a respondent who says, when are you, colleagues asked me the question, when are you leaving? I do not find the question very friendly at first, but when I remember how I gave the impression I was still completely into my Belgian identity, I think it was logical. Because for them, I don't make any effort. After that, it's not because you do not like eating poutine that they pick you out, but I think it's because I was saying too often in Belgium, we do this, that way, and so on, that and not that. So how do we technically define these fragments of failure? The fragments of failure would be some practices that enable us to capture what could lead in the foreseeable future SIs to experience some failure. So this key finding is crystallized in the triptych, as I said, in a triptych of three main elements. So first you have the relational attachment, then you have a discursive attachment, because it's not only about being relationally bounded in a kind of network of relationships, it's also about saying things that make the others realize that you do not really fit in this world that you made the decision to join. And then they are practical attachment, and those practical attachments are not about what you say about your experience, but about some practical things that would betray eventually that your mind is still in your home country while your body is technically here in the host country. So, as I said, this a systematic comparison between the home country and the host country that would crystallize in a discursive and relational and a practical attachment will actually be those three key elements that the expatriate will have in mind when they will compare or evaluate their own experience. So this was the end of this second part of the presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Kamila. So
thank you.
We even with some technical flaws, we practically made it on time. So we have 15 minutes for your comments, questions, and answer. So feel free to. Anybody who wants to bring a comment or a question?
Roger, if no one else wants to, but I'm happy to give someone else the word. Otherwise, I'm always ready to speak.
Yeah, go ahead, Gregor.
Okay, well, thank you for these great presentations. And for those who were there from the beginning, you can say, well, how do we link these together? Is there a thread? And I see a thread. It might not be the right way, but I think one of the core themes that we've been hearing for the past few days is this continuum between absolute subordination and emancipation. And at the one end, Kai is in a universe where he's seeing hyper subordination through technological controls. And at the other end, Kamila is exploring forms of emancipation where people seek to give themselves projects which take them out of a normal realm of subordination because they become agents of their own life trajectory. And then the two value chain connections with Cambodia and Bangladesh, it's trying to take the workers somewhat out of the realm of subordination and give them some voice in some ways. And I particularly appreciated Li Min's idea of weaponized interdependence. But I think that all of these contributions, and it's sounding more like a comment than a question, but if you'll bear with me, just there are different levels of analysis here. So I would be very interested in Kai's case of, it's as if Geneviève doesn't quite have agency. And it's easy to do that with the data approach and the hyper surveillance, but we might need to know a little more about her agency, just in the sense that maybe it's because she lives in a rural area, maybe it's because she's the daughter-in-law with her husband's parents. I'm assuming that's the connection, but maybe, you know, Burraway and all the others have always found ways of resistance and ways of workers having agency despite the surveillance. But by the same token, we probably need to know a little more in Kamila's case about how organizational and societal structures are playing in these projects that people have. And then the two value chains, we really want to know a little more, I know, about the societal impacts, and maybe whether, I think that Li Min in particular highlights a greater degree of agency because so many aspects are related to industrial relations governance. So there's not really a question there, but I'll throw that out because I think there are links between the presentations, and in particular, maybe for Christopher, it's that question of, we're talking a lot about GUFs and about the ILO and about these other structures. Is either it's hard to get down, but how do we get agency out of this? We seem to see it somewhat in Li Min's case, and it's a lack of agency that we see in your case. There are lots of structures, but little agency.
Thank you, Gregor. Just before asking our panelists to comment on Gregor's views, is anyone else would like to comment or ask a question so that we will then leave our panelists to bring their own viewpoints?
Roger, we can encourage the panelists to comment on each other too.
Yeah.
So it's a conversation.
Yeah, so I don't see anyone asking for a question. So let's our panelists comments and exchange among themselves.
Kai here, calling in. Thank you very much, Gregor, for your comment. And I absolutely agree. There is agency, and I think that is how I kind of framed the presentation as well. So I did not display the dimension around gender and gender analysis in my presentation, but that was actually a big part of the analysis that I was doing. And then in many ways in rural India, you know, women are not really seen in public. In this particular workplace, they had a particular interest in hiring women so that they can gain access to the world of work. And you know, in furthering this analysis, it also looks at, you know, this firm also plays a role in creating this rural kind of gender social contract in the location that they're in, where women now, I don't know if it's a free or open choice, where they have more options to become, you know, good daughters, good wives, but now also good workers. But there are, so these are also burdens at the same time, right? So I am also pulled at how to further this type of analysis. A second point around agency. So these are quite young workers. And one thing that I do gain from working in this is a professionalization of a workplace that's in technology, which have social connotations of success. And they also gain access to English language training, because everything is in that. So there's a lot of like post-colonial analysis around the languages in India and the power of English and access to social mobility and opportunity. So many of them, you know, when they're going to be married, they would have to leave to join, you know, their husbands often, right? So I think there are a lot of particularities that definitely I do want to investigate more.
Any other comments? Connection with agencies and
I had
Kamila?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, regarding the introductory note by Gregor Murray, and to make the bridge with Kai's presentation, the reason did actually in my work to like see, I mean, I can see kind of reflection of this analysis and Kai's work, and that complements very well. It's the idea of a micro power. So this Foucauldian micro power, where we can see that there is some kind of infiltration of thoughts in the respondents I had the opportunity to interview. We can see that what is very interesting is that those people have also this idea of the preset concept of failure and success. But what it says about power is that it is not at first sight the immediate capture of this result. Those results can be individual level. But then when we hear the presentation that was made by Kai, we can see that the idea of some kind of surveillance and control is more embedded in people's minds than we can actually imagine, because here we have two cases that are not situated at the same level technically and methodologically, but then we can actually capture some kind of evidences that surveillance is everywhere, and this institutionalization is so, I would say, so elegantly performed that it can actually infiltrate respondents' thoughts and people's thoughts without even having in mind that this is one of the parameters that will be observed. And so what is really interesting in it is that we may be interested in different levels of analysis, but then at the end of the day, we can see that we are all investigating realities that take shape actually in the same context, which is the current globalized context. And so we can find in all of these some some points in common or some evidences that there is something that goes deeper than the main technical institutional structures. So that was a point I found very, very interesting, and I really see that in this research too.
Thank you, Kamila. Min Lee? Is Lee there? She asked. Evelyn, is Min Lee still connected?
She's officially connected, but she's not reactive.
Yeah, she just asked for.
So if we're waiting, I can
Christopher, because we're near
at
the end of it. So let's go, Christopher, and then we'll see if Min Lee is connecting.
But no, I appreciate the question about agency. For me, I think you're right in pointing out that workers have demonstrated a great amount of agency. I think you see that particularly in the mobilization around wages. These efforts were driven by worker protests that spun out of individual factory disputes and ended up sweeping significant parts around the Dhaka capital and Savar and Ashulia. And even the unions themselves, I think, historically, we've seen a hesitance for many of the internationally affiliated unions to support workers during protests, but during the 2018 unrest, unions quickly followed workers' demands for an increased minimum wage. And I think that pressure was what forced the formation of the minimum wage boards. The question that remains is, how to deal with employers' entrenchment in the local economic and political systems. And I think thus far, that's an open question, and international efforts, particularly by the global union federations, in conjunction with local unions, hasn't been able to push employers out of their stance. But I'll let Min Lee speak.
Okay. It's your turn, Min Lee. I think you join us again, Min Lee.
Min Lee, you can hear us. I know she wrote to me that she can hear us, but we're not able to hear her. We're gonna see if she's able to write her questions.
Yeah.
I think if somebody else has a question, Roger, you may keep on and I'll keep you in.
Yeah. Anyone else who would like to speak? We're near the end of our session.
Let the chairman speak.
No.
Can I quickly jump in? Kai here from calling from Montreal. On the value chain research, I'm actually quite interested to hear your take on how might COVID-19 change. I think we're definitely going through rapid changes, and there's a lot unexpected futures, looking at the scenarios of unionization and trans-union movement, let's say, how might this be changed when globalization might be looking more inwards, and there are talks about, potentially technology is a new globalization force. I was wondering, if any panelists or anyone here have thoughts on that.
And I think you've got Min Lee back.
Min Lee, are you with us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Good.
Oh, yes, thank you. I have a question to Kai. You just mentioned data relations in industrial relation. What's meaning data relations? Kai?
Sure, I will quickly respond. So I'm actually developing a theory, and it's still very young, so I don't want to share it too much. I have a diagram of it, but the idea came out last year. So data relations, the concept looks through how data extraction from a post-colonial lens, where the extractive powers of colonizers are being put on similar lens of new tech companies, and how, if we think about COVID-19, it is often used as an opportunity to say, okay, we're going to introduce different tools that can help us, but also there are potential unseen or unknown consequences, right? In terms of the data that we are trading off to have the conveniences. So this data relations is actually talking about the data life cycle, right? From the surveillance, from the data value creation to the data value capture. And then within that, the value of this is looking at the data relations where consent is manufactured, similar to what Boroway have said before. There's a complex privacy trade-off. Then we're seeing the immaterial production of labor in obscurity, right? And also the immaterial production in obscurity. And lastly, there is, and I think this is the most concerning part, but I want to build this more, and I hope to share this theory next time when we are able to gather in person. It's around human re-engineering. So, and also and this is tied to the monopolistic tendencies of all of these activities that we're seeing through the network effects. And, the fetishization of accuracy over what each data point is, right, that was demonstrated, is a bit of saying, human judgment is important, but really something else is controlling what human judgment is, in the sense of like, you need to give the accurate judgment. And that has a lot of wrong implications in terms of who makes these judgments and whose imagination and whose projection of the world matters. So this is where it's like the data relations concept is very new. It is almost in infancy, and I want to build onto it and say like, okay, how can we look at this also through an industrial relations lens?
Okay, thank you. I have a second question to ask Christopher. I wonder the minimum wage bargaining. In China, we don't need to bargaining the minimum wage. It's a low level to protect workers' rights. So, so in Bangladesh, so you just mentioned the minimum wage tripartite bargaining. So could you explain?
Yeah, so minimum wage bargaining in Bangladesh happens at the sectoral level. So it's set independently for the garment industry versus the jute industry, for example. And it serves as a de facto wage for the entire industry. Employers tend not to go up, although there are certain pay grades within the scale, depending on the job classification and time in the workforce. But it's nominally tripartite in that there's representatives from the state itself, from labor, and from the Employers Association. But what happens frequently, and this happened again in the most recent minimum wage negotiations, was that the labor representative wasn't chosen by unions or workers themselves. It was appointed by the state. And so, although unions and workers were pretty unified in their demands, unlike previous iterations, the labor minister wasn't, or the labor representative wasn't interested in strongly advocating. And what ultimately happened was the government unilaterally decided to set the minimum wage because of pressure just before the December 2018 elections.
Okay, thank you. It's quite different from China. You know, in China, the minimum wage ordered by government, evaluated CPI, and the wage, something data, then the order, the local, I mean, the provincial government then announce minimum wage every year or every 2 years. We don't need to negotiate. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
Yeah. Just to maybe to add on the minimum wage, in countries where you have a high proportion of the labor force in labor intensive activities like apparel, garment, footwear, you tend to have a minimum wage which is sometime promulgated by the government, but some other time follows some kind of more or less a national or a regional negotiation. This is the case in Bangladesh, but I think it's also the case in Cambodia, and it is the case in Vietnam also, because it sets the standard for most of the workers, like you said, in Bangladesh, and to my knowledge, Vietnam, which I know a little bit more, most of the garment and footwear workers do work under the minimum wage with some kind of progression based on seniority or performance production performance. So we're near the end of our, we in fact are 10 minutes out of our time, but it's a very interesting conversation. So anyone else would like to input in our conversation?
Evelyn, can I just ask, do we have another group who should be in the room now?
Well, the rooms are not necessarily limited, and I'm not holding a second session right afterwards, so you don't have to worry about it. If you want to go on to another presentation, it's still an option, depending if you're presenting or not. But other than that, I'm not holding another technical session until lunchtime, actually. So
sorry, Roger, I just wanted to check for Evelyn's constraint.
Thank you.
Yeah, no. Anyone else who'd like to say a word?
Can I ask, I was looking at Transparency International for the relative corruption of public practices. Bangladesh is 146 out of 180 countries. Cambodia is 162 out of 180 countries. In other words, they're in the, between the 80th and the 90th percentile in terms of relative corruption. So they're in the same range. And yet, and it seemed like Min had a more optimistic assessment of the state role relative to Christopher, who clearly everything was running up against, and of course you can't just talk about the state because the state is being corrupted by other actors. So it's the interpenetration of the garment employers and the state. But in Cambodia, is there something that, and we're interested in what Christopher has to say, but in Cambodia, is there something that minimizes or alleviates some of the issues of corruption in industrial relations governance in the way that you were able to observe it? Because it's a real problem, and when people talk about the dysfunctioning of the both cases, you're often referring to rampant corruption.
Yeah, you know, Gregor, there are many Chinese enterprises invested in Cambodia. So there's a special economic zone besides the capital of Cambodia. So we visited several enterprises, and we talked to the local government officials and the owners of factories. Yes, there existing some corruption, but comparing with the previous years, it's improved. So I admit corruption existing. Yeah, but the situation changed a little bit.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead, Christopher.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think the biggest difference in what separates Bangladesh from some other garment producing countries, one is how organized and powerful the employers associations are. I think relative to other garment producing countries, the BGMA is particularly well organized and has influenced the state fairly strongly. I think it speaks both to their monopoly over garment producers. Unlike a lot of other countries, Bangladesh's garment industry is primarily nationally owned rather than having significant foreign ownership, which I think alters the dynamics of the relationship between employers and the state. And also, I think the lack of wide adoption of a program like Better Works, unlike Cambodia, where at least for a while, I think it's still the case, export is predicated on participation within the process, which I think theoretically could offer some transparency or at least another form of governance and stability within the sector. Adoption in Bangladesh has been incredibly low, proportional to garment export factories.
Agree with Christopher.
Yeah, and is it the case also, Christopher? A year or two ago, I read that in Bangladesh, you mentioned that contrary to, for example, Cambodia and Vietnam, where most of the factories are foreign owned, in Bangladesh they are nationally owned. But what I read is that there's a strong link between the manufacturers and the politician, in the sense that a quite large number of owners are also seating either themselves or through surrogates in parliament. So there seems to be a huge connection between the government and the owners.
Yeah, I think it's roughly about 10% of sitting MPs are own garment factories, and a number have outside of that have familial connections as well. But I mean, prior to democratization in the 1990s, you would see explicit collaboration between the state and employers to avoid unions and repress unionization within the sector. And even now, the practice continues where if employers find out about unionization efforts, I mean, often they'll dismiss workers, but they'll also contact the Ministry of Labor to deny the union's registration. Although there was reforms to the trade union law in 2013, there still exists a clause where it gives the Ministry of Labor discretion over the acceptance of trade union registration. So even if workers are able to present the proper paperwork, the government still has discretion over whether or not to permit or to allow them to organize officially. And it often goes back and forth where the Ministry of Labor will inform employers of attempts to organize or of the filing of registration.
So last person who would like to input? Okay, so well, thank you everybody for your excellent presentation. I think we had a very rich material from different part of the world. We are in a global world. We don't know exactly where it is going these days, but we are globalized through our conversation and also through the topics that we dealt with today. So once again, thank you everybody for your excellent contribution, and take care in each of your part of the world.
And
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night, good afternoon, and good morning.
Yeah. Good night.
Bye bye everybody. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye Minli.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye Kai.